Have you read Northanger Abbey? I ask because I hadn't. I have read all of Austen's other works, but this was the first time that I had the pleasure of meeting Miss Catherine Morland.
Miss Morland, delighted to make your acquaintance.
And let me say, I was surprised to find that this was the absolute funniest Jane Austen novel.
Now we may talk to one another.
We've already been talking.
You mustn't allow anyone to hear you say such things.
Northanger Abbey was the first of Austen's novels that she attempted to publish. It was written sometime between 1798 and 1799 when she was 23 or 24. She had previously written parts of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility before. And she sold it to a publishing house called Crosby & Co. for £10. So that's £1,000 today, roughly. But they didn't publish it. They sat on it. They just let it be. 6 years later, Jane Austen even wrote under a pseudonym to Crosby & Company that she wanted it published, and she wanted to make sure that maybe they hadn't just lost a copy of the manuscript. So she said, "Hey, I've got another copy here if you want it." And they said, "No, we don't need it." Jane Austen threatens that she will approach other publishers to publish what is then called Susan and will become Northanger Abbey. The publishing house, Crosby & Co., says, "We are going to take legal action against any publishing house that publishes this because we own the copyright to it," somewhat justly, and that if Miss Austen would like her copyright back, she will have to return to them the sum of £10. It just kind of sat in limbo. After the publication of her three most famous novels, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma, between 1811 and 1815, Jane Austen was finally able to afford to buy back the copyright on Susan. She went through a certain series of edits, we assume, though she really didn't modernize it too much. The social scene that is portrayed in Northanger Abbey is much more similar to 1799 Bath than it is to 1810 Bath, as we can even see in kind of that direct comparison between Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, both of which have very pivotal scenes in Bath. She bought it back. She, it appears, had every intention of attempting to sell it to a publisher again, but she was going to get it published. She was making moves for Northanger Abbey, which at this point had its heroine's name changed to Catherine and the name of the novel changed to Northanger Abbey. And then she got sick. And Jane Austen had some form of kidney issue. They're not sure if it's lymphoma, if it was some other kidney disease, but in any case, between 1816 and very early 1817, Jane Austen's physical health deteriorates very rapidly, and eventually she dies. But that is not the end of the story, very thankfully. Jane Austen's brother, Henry, knew what she had been writing, and he got copies of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion ready for publication, and they were published in December of 1817, so less than a full year after her death. Though I think the copyright for them does say 1818 was when they were published, but it was December of 1817. That's a fun trivia fact. So Northanger Abbey sits really interestingly at both the start of Austen's career and at the end of it, because we get a picture into that original juvenile author. Not that she was even juvenile really here, but it was pre-Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. And what I really do appreciate about Northanger Abbey is it really shows us where Austen is aiming to go. I would say the closest sister to this is Pride and Prejudice. It's very dialogue heavy. It's got just the kind of singular female lead more so than Sense and Sensibility, which is the two sisters. And I mean, I guess with the Bennets, it's five sisters, but Elizabeth is firmly our lead character, even if Jane is there. She is implementing literary devices that she doesn't really implement ever again. The way that she breaks the fourth wall is legitimately very funny, again and again and again. When she is discussing Catherine's qualities within the very first page, it starts with, "No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine." And it goes on to basically list all the tropes of Gothic novel. She's not really that handsome. She's not really that smart. She's not dreadfully poor. She's not wonderfully well off. Her parents are not neglectful. She doesn't have a dead mother and lots of siblings. She grows up in a parsonage, but her father is not some moral, harsh authority on her. Austen basically sets her up to be an every woman. And what this does for Catherine is she really becomes a blank slate. Both at the start of the novel, she is a blank slate, but she becomes a blank slate for Jane Austen's audience, both to meet the author and to meet Catherine, our heroine, who was originally named Susan, but is now Catherine. At 17, she has spent all of her life in Fullerton and the family's modest home. While Catherine does like to read novels, she isn't good at reading people. The novels that she reads leave a lot wanting. They're Gothic novels. So she is pretty naive about the world and the people in it, partially because her family and the people around her are straight-talking, well-meaning folk. Catherine's main conflict throughout the novel is meeting other people and trying to figure out what they mean, because she is straight-talking. She kind of thinks everyone should be doing what they say they're doing and meaning what they say, and it turns out that they're not. Catherine has to learn that not every person that she meets is well-meaning or worthy of her friendship. It's difficult for her to learn this because Catherine just isn't very perceptive. For example, when her friend Isabella announces that she is engaged to Catherine's brother, and this is an expected plot point if you, the reader, are reading this, Isabella believes that Catherine has been aware this whole time what has been going on, and that the two are in love and marriage can only be the result. And as a reader, we learn from this not to trust Catherine's perceptions, because she does not know what is going on. She has not observed anyone's motivation accurately. Catherine is an intelligent girl, even if she is naive and not perceptive, and her good-naturedness and desire to think well of others is difficult to overcome. Other than her caring nature, I would say her integrity is her strongest characteristic. James Morland is the brother of Catherine, and James is a student at Oxford with John Thorpe. And James is mild but very caring, kind of like Catherine. He's not very perceptive either because he's in love with Isabella. The two become engaged but break it off when she begins a flirtation with Captain Frederick Tilney. While no means poor, James Morland's prospects aren't so good as to afford the lifestyle that Isabella is seeking, and something she was unaware of when she got engaged to James. So Isabella was under this impression that James had much more money than he did, and that he might even ultimately be the heir to the Allen family, the people who brought Catherine to Bath. She knows that they're wealthy because Mrs. Allen was a good friend with her mother, Mrs. Thorpe. So Mr. and Mrs. Morland and the rest of the family, the Morlands are from a rural town in Fullerton. We only visit the Morlands briefly at the very start and at the very end of the story, and they are practical people, especially compared to General Tilney and the Allens. And though well-meaning, they have many children, and Mrs. Morland does not have time to focus on Catherine and her education. So Catherine is kind of launched into the world as this blank slate. When Catherine is returned at the end of the novel by General Tilney in a really disrespectful manner, the family disapproves and is really upset by this breach of etiquette, but ultimately the Morlands kind of just move on. They don't hold a slight. There are no grudges types of people. Mr. and Mrs. Allen are neighbors with the Morlands, and they take Catherine with them to Bath as a companion to Mrs. Allen. They are a childless couple, and General Tilney and Thorpe speculate that their fortune may be being left to Catherine, or in the Thorpe's case, James, maybe, or Catherine, they're not sure. And Mrs. Allen is mostly interested in gowns and fashion and the social scene in Bath, but Catherine is really always very kind to her. I think it speaks a lot to Catherine's character that she is so willing to spend a lot of time with Mrs. Allen and doesn't really see anything negative with her. She's just kind. Mrs. Allen is just somewhat indecisive and attentive. But Mr. Allen does express some clear moral opinions throughout the novel that Catherine does take to heart, and they don't aim to let calamity befall Catherine. So while they're not the perfect guardians of a young teenage girl, they're a little lax, but they're not just like letting anything happen to her, as would be the case in a more traditional Gothic novel. And that's kind of one of the themes here. It is the un-Gothic novel. It's a parody, but it's not quite a parody. It threads the needle, if you will. So next we're going to talk about the Tilneys. So Henry Tilney is our dashing hero. He is 26 years old and he is a parson at the small village of Woodston. He is intelligent, he is well-tempered, and he certainly enjoys the sound of his own voice. Perhaps my personal favorite thing about Henry Tilney is that he is a grammar police person. He likes words to be used very precisely and exactly the way they should be, and he'll call people out when they're not using them correctly. And most people hate this, as they should. But Catherine doesn't even always totally get it, and she doesn't even know to be offended by it. I almost suspect that he falls in love with her because she does not get mad at him for correcting her grammar. He's very well read, he enjoys novels, and he does not really want to embarrass people, but he does kind of do a little wordplay and word trickery on them. And Catherine is really naive and good-natured, and it's kind of a good fit for Henry's natural paternalistic teaching. I would say that Catherine kind of falls in love with Henry first, and then he falls in love with her because he realizes her moral integrity. He does grow to love her, and he does love to teach her because he finds that she is an intelligent person. It's just that she hasn't really been instructed for most of her life. That might hit the ick on some people. Eleanor Tilney is Henry's sister and eventually Catherine's friend. She is very shy and quiet, and her shyness prevents her from making many friends in Bath. Eleanor is isolated at Northanger Abbey, where she is under the thumb of her domineering father, General Tilney. She has no close friends and no social neighbors, and especially after the death of her mother. Eleanor struggles with being alone without Henry often, and she really enjoys reading like her brother and spending time in a wider social situation. General Tilney is a domineering father to Henry and Eleanor and Frederick. He is a widower and a modernizer. He is very concerned with material things and takes great pride in his home, but not the part that you would guess because it's an abbey, Northanger Abbey. He is proud of the modernizations that he has made to this beautiful historic abbey that do not match the original architecture at all. He is occupied always in earning money and spending it. Tilney wants his children to marry wealthy people, and he only encourages a relationship between Catherine and Henry when he believes that it is going to be a financially fruitful one. Once he learns that Catherine is not wealthy, he behaves pretty abominably and throws her out of Northanger Abbey. Frederick Tilney, or Captain Frederick Tilney, is the oldest sibling of the Tilney family. He is a flirt and given to trouble. He is the closest character to his father, personality-wise, and that is signaled by they are always referred to by their title, would imply some sort of military rigidness about their personalities. Frederick flirts with Isabella Thorpe and leads her to break off her engagement with James Morland, and then he abandons her in Bath with no prospects. The Thorpes. Isabella Thorpe is one of Mrs. Thorpe's 3 daughters and the sister to John. Isabella is Catherine's best friend, and that's kind of for the first half of the book. The girls bond over clothing, Gothic novels, and gossip. She is not wealthy and tries to hide that by using accessories to make her appearance look different since she can't regularly have new gowns. She enjoys flirting and kind of appears a bit boy crazy, though she truly may just be looking for the best match possible, which in and of itself is not really reprehensible. Her mercenary and flirtatious nature, though, is kind of a contrast to Catherine and Eleanor Tilney, and it causes her to lose James and perhaps Frederick, though I'm pretty sure she never really had him on the hook because the general was never going to approve a marriage with such a poor character. And then we have John Thorpe, who is the absolute worst. I want to punch him in the face, and I hate him. He is conceited and arrogant and given to boasting and exaggeration, both positively and negatively, about Catherine to General Tilney. He is the one who misleads the general about how wealthy Catherine is, and then he misleads him by saying she's also very, very poor later after Catherine rejects him. I don't think he's in love with Catherine. I think he wants to marry her because he thinks she's really rich, and it just doesn't work out for him because he just shows himself time and time again to not have much integrity, to be pretty rude, to not value her commitments, and he goes out of his way to trick Catherine several times in trying to keep her away from the Tilney family after she already has said that she would do something with them, and Catherine's just not interested in that. So he's dead man walking with Catherine pretty quickly. He at one point does believe that Catherine is in love with him and thinks that he is going to propose to her, but Catherine has to dissuade that. Mrs. Thorpe is the widowed mother of the 4 children. She is concerned primarily with gossip, fashion, and money, and she takes great pride in her children. And though they are not wealthy, they are able to come to Bath for the season. And those are our main characters in Northanger Abbey. And now the plot. The plot goes thus. The novel has 3 main settings. You're going to have the social comedy location of Bath, you're going to have the Gothic romance setting at Northanger Abbey, and then kind of the banal return to childhood home. We open in Fullerton, where Catherine is joining the Allens on a trip to Bath. Bath is the resort for the wealthy to upper middle class members of British society. Catherine is eager to accept the invitation. Catherine finds Bath like as a whole new world, because it's a huge contrast to Fullerton, kind of this small and socially isolated place where she's been from. The amount of society and things to do is really in sharp contrast to Fullerton, because Catherine just largely walked to fill her time or visited with Mrs. Allen. Catherine is introduced to Henry Tilney, a young clergyman, at a dance at the lower rooms. He is very witty, and one of the first acquaintances she makes. Catherine falls in love after one conversation with Henry, and then is dismayed when he does not appear for several weeks in Bath. Mrs. Allen runs into her school friend, Mrs. Thorpe, with her 3 daughters, and Catherine and Isabella are soon very good friends by circumstance more than anything, but also a love of the Gothic novels. But they don't really have a ton in common. Isabella introduces Catherine to the superficial side of Bath's society with balls and dances and shows and fashion and the gossip. After Isabella and Catherine become friends, their brothers arrive. James Morland and John Thorpe are friends at Oxford, and Isabella quickly begins to flirt with James, whom she has met before, and John attempts to woo Catherine and asks her to be his dance partner. Catherine sees Henry at the next ball and is much more interested in Henry Tilney. Catherine has to give up dancing with Henry in order to honor her obligation with John, who arrives to it late. Soon, Isabella is going to devote all of her time to winning James, and Catherine is left out of their conversations when they're together. And she basically is like, I need a new friend. I need someone else to hang out with. And so she seeks out Eleanor Tilney. Catherine clearly does this partially because she's in love with Henry, which Eleanor catches on to pretty quickly. Catherine isn't even aware that's why she wants to be friends with Eleanor, but it turns out Eleanor's a nice girl, so that works out for her. Catherine really does seem to long to go and have a friend because of her lost connection with Isabella. She plans a walk with Eleanor and Henry, but rain appears to wash them out. Catherine is persuaded by James and Isabella and John to go riding out. But on the way, she spots Henry and Eleanor on their way to pick her up for the walk. And she begs John Thorpe to turn around, to let her get out. She wants to honor that obligation, and he refuses to. And at that point, that's the end of John Thorpe for Catherine. She's not interested in him. And as far as Austen villains go, I find him in many ways to be the most reprehensible, because he's just not charming at all. He's a jerk. And there's no charm to that. At least with Wickham and Crawford, you kind of like have this dashing villain kind of thing instead of just this pompous jerk, which is all Catherine got. And I guess that speaks to Austen's evolving form, because Wickham and Crawford are inventions of later. So Catherine apologizes to Eleanor and Henry. Plans are made for another walk. John, Isabella, and James try and pressure Catherine out of that outing as well, and Catherine firmly refuses. John Thorpe leaves the conversation to go talk to the Tilneys and be like, sorry, Catherine can't make it. And he comes back and he tells her that he does this, and Catherine freaks out and she chases after them, and she wants to affirm that, yes, indeed, I plan to honor my obligation to you. I'm not going out with them. But everyone's super mad at Catherine for not going, because Isabella and James can't go if Catherine doesn't go as sort of a chaperone. It can't be 2 men and 1 woman. It can be 2 women and 2 men, which kind of seems like they both could turn the other way from each other, but that's just social conventions. But this is where Mr. Allen does step in at one point and say, hey, I don't think you should be doing this because it's really not appropriate. And Catherine listens to him after that. She's able to, it's kind of like when your mom needs to come pick you up from a sleepover and you're like, Mom, I don't want to be here anymore. And she's like, just say I made you come home. This is what Mr. Allen has given Catherine. He says, you shouldn't be doing that. And after that, Catherine says, sorry, I can't go. Mr. Allen says it's not appropriate. Isabella and James get engaged, and he decides he's going to go to Fullerton to get the parents' permission and find out what kind of financial situation he can expect so he can have a reasonable timeline of when they can get married. And John Thorpe is also going to go to London at this time, and he leaves with this misapprehension that Catherine is in love with him and is going to want to marry him, which she does not. Frederick Tilney shows up at this point, Henry's older brother, and he arrives at Bath, and Isabella and Henry begin to flirt with each other. Isabella is disappointed with how much money the Morlands supply for James, believing that he was much wealthier than he was, and because of that, her head is turned by Captain Tilney, who is the heir of Northanger Abbey. Eleanor invites Catherine to Northanger, which Catherine happily accepts, and Catherine has kind of like Gothic fantasies about what the Abbey is going to be like. And before she leaves, Isabella tells Catherine that John is planning to propose to her, and Catherine asks Isabella to say, no, you tell him I don't want that this is a misunderstanding. And then Frederick appears after that conversation. He starts to flirt with Isabella in front of Catherine. Catherine's really bothered by this. So she begs Henry to tell his brother to back off and leave Isabella alone, and Henry will not, but he assures Catherine that Frederick is harmless and that nothing major is going to come of this. He's going to join his regiment soon. So on the trip to Northanger, Catherine shares her fantasies about a haunted abbey with Henry, and Henry is amused, and he tries to kind of scare her with this picture of a Gothic abbey, which has hidden doors and storms in the dead of night. And actually, the abbey is just kind of a plain old boring old building, and it's been fixed up by the general. And Catherine does imagine a strange kind of cabinet in her room that holds a great mystery and freaks herself out, but it turns out it's just full of laundry receipts, the ultimate letdown. Catherine becomes intrigued by the death of Eleanor and Henry's mother, and soon she comes to the conclusion that the general murdered his wife and does not like to speak of her and did not want her portrait hung up, so he definitely murdered her. This is kind of crazy. It's super crazy. Catherine is crazy for thinking this, but this is kind of and we'll get into this. It's a reflection of what she's been reading and how she reads other people. So she sneaks into Eleanor and Henry's mother's room, which has been preserved, thinking maybe she'll find a clue to the murder. And she looks around and there's nothing there. There's no reason to suspect anything. She leaves and Henry catches her, and he pretty quickly realizes that she suspects the general of having murdered his mom. And he's in disbelief. He is shocked that Catherine would have this belief. And he's like, these things can't be covered up. Catherine is mortified when she realizes the error of her thought, and she leaves in tears, but she lets go of it pretty quickly. She lets go of her childish imaginations, and she is much more mature after this instance. Catherine receives a letter that her brother's engagement to Isabella has been called off. She is certain that this news will follow, that Isabella is now engaged to Frederick, but Henry and Eleanor are not so certain about that. No such announcement comes, and ultimately Isabella writes Catherine and pleads with her to help her reconcile with James, but Catherine has finally learned to read people a little bit better and realizes that Isabella is just not a good person, so she doesn't respond. Catherine does get to visit Henry's house at Woodston. While there, she can easily picture herself living there with Henry. The general hints at a future marriage between the two. When they return to the Abbey, both General and Henry leave, so it's just Eleanor and Catherine alone. They have a really good time. They're really bonding. Their friendship is growing. And then all of a sudden, the general shows up, and he is in a rage, and he demands that Eleanor needs to make Catherine leave as soon as possible. Turns out he ran into John Thorpe in London, and John Thorpe said, hey, remember when I told you Catherine was super rich? Well, she's not. She's super poor. And the general, because he only cares about how wealthy the people his kids marry are, he's like, get out. She's got to leave. She's got to go. And so Eleanor is forced to make Catherine leave with no protection on the road. She's going to go 70 miles home with no one to watch after her. Anything could have happened to Catherine. So it's an incredibly rude and unfeeling thing for the general to have done to her. She gets home, her family is like, that's weird, that wasn't good. Anyways, and then Henry shows up and he's like, I love you, Catherine, actually. And she says, I love you too. And her parents say, you can't get married until the general approves. And they're like, he'll never approve. And that's not true, because Eleanor's love interest comes into his viscounty. He's a viscount now, so he's rich. So she gets married to him, and they're really happy. And she says, Dad, you should really let Catherine marry Henry. And he's like, oh, I guess you made such a good match. And so they get married. And while Henry and Catherine feel that this is such a long time, it was such a huge wait, how could they made us wait so long? Jane Austen assures us that they were married within 1 year of meeting. And that is the plot of Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey could at times be considered a Gothic novel, but generally I would say it is Gothic parody. At times it very explicitly avoids the tropes, while at other times it completely embraces them. Catherine is in fact a silly girl who reads Gothic novels. She truly is invited to an abbey, and General Tilney does have a sense of foreboding about him. The reality of the situation, that the abbey is just an ordinary old building and the general is just an unpleasant man. The main instance outside of simply discussing actual Gothic novels that parody comes into play is when Henry's kind of narrating this Gothic scene to Catherine on the way to Bath to Northanger, and he uses all the tropes of like the secret passageways, and there's a weapon, and there's a storm, and it's scary, and there's ghosts and chains. I mean, it kind of scared me actually. And then the second is when Catherine is afraid in her room on that first night because it's storming and it's dark, and she's suddenly quite afraid, and she sees this mysterious cabinet, and surely there's something in it, but she can't open it. And in the morning she does, and it's just a cabinet full of laundry receipts. What a disappointment. The worst form of parody, though, comes when Catherine starts suspecting that General Tilney has killed his wife. And the setting of the Abbey and the novels that she's been reading kind of prime her to believe this false belief. And the general, while domineering and generally unpleasant, and Catherine the whole time says like she just gets the bad vibes from him. She does not like him. Like, it's still kind of crazy to think that he could murder his wife and get away with it, even in the Regency period. That just isn't something that someone could easily get away with in Britain. And when confronted by Henry with this misconception, she flees, and there's this tension of where her delusions are broken. And the Gothic era of the novel pretty much evaporates immediately after that, and it's done, and she appears much less silly after this. And then with that kind of thought comes this theme of youth and disillusionment. So Catherine begins our novel very immature and naive, and she is willing to trust pretty much anyone with anything. Her whole family, though, is described as just straight talking people. They say what they mean, they say what they think, and that's that. The young Catherine we meet of the first few pages is kind of just this ultimate of naivety. Her mother doesn't have much sense of educating her daughter, and she's pretty much ignorant and a bit stupid, is how Jane Austen describes her. Catherine loves nothing more than just rolling in the grass and going on long hikes, but she is really good with children, and she's a good heart. She's not stubborn, she's not quarrelsome. So despite kind of being this woefully ignorant person, there is kind of this naturalism and kindness to Catherine that the reader should find admirable when we meet kind of the more fashionable and rude characters of Bath. And this really contrasts nicely with these three other fashionable women that we meet at the same time. So we have Mrs. Allen, who is the one who takes Catherine to Bath, and she is chiefly concerned with fashion, and she is kind of more concerned with society that she meets and ensuring Catherine's safety or overly vetting the people she's around. And Mr. Allen acts as a buffer in this case, so Catherine is not left just morally in the wind. But nevertheless, Mrs. Allen does feel a bit neglectful of Catherine's acquaintances, and she doesn't really step in and say, this really isn't a proper thing for you to be doing. Isabella Thorpe and her mother kind of appears in answered prayer for Catherine and Mrs. Allen when they first arrive at Bath. They've kind of been longing to have just somebody that they know in Bath to be friends with, and here they are. And Isabella sets the stage for the friendship, kind of focusing Catherine towards dresses and balls and fashion and quizzing. Oh, well, quizzes are like practical jokes, by the way, and witticism. Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Thorpe are just having this discussion about their own interests and kind of just speaking over each other. They're having the same conversation, but just at the same time, if that makes sense. They're having two different conversations at the same time. So Mrs. Allen is speaking about fashion, which makes her feel better because Mrs. Thorpe is poor, clearly poorer than she is. And then Mrs. Thorpe talks about her children, and that kind of makes Mrs. Allen feel bad because she doesn't have any children. Catherine falls in love with Henry Tilney at the first meeting, but she doesn't understand that she has fallen in love. Instead, she just has this desire to be around Mr. Tilney, and Mr. Tilney would probably seem paternalistic, as I've said, to a modern reader, and he often tries to instruct Catherine so that she kind of takes on his point of view. But I would argue that Austen's point here is that Mr. Tilney sees Catherine's naiveness, and he kind of wants to show her true and beautiful things. So when he kind of instructs her about how an artist would view a certain area for a painting, Catherine really enjoys learning about that. She's happy to hear it from him. And it's the same thing when he discusses books. And Catherine doesn't just immediately give way to his point of view. So he tries to convince her that histories are great. And she's like, don't know about that. I like my trashy Gothic novels, but I certainly don't like your histories. And then Eleanor kind of swoops in with this bridge of, there's something to be said for the historical fiction where it's the events that truly happened, but maybe we get the invented king's speech and we get to know the characters and you feel a narrative investment into the history. And that's kind of what the three kind of end up being is a marriage of these ideas of what is a good thing to invest your time and your sense and your mind into, because what you focus on in a literary sense or an educational sense is really going to shape how your perceptions are in the outside world. What Tilney loves most about Catherine, though, is her integrity and her youthfulness of, she's not like this jaded woman yet. She really does believe the best in people. She doesn't read into everything. She doesn't feel scheming. And I think Henry Tilney just likes being around somebody who's kind of nice. So she just generally thinks well of the people around her. And if Isabella is an example of how fashionable people act, then Henry Tilney falling in love with Catherine's youthful, unspoiled integrity and kindness, that I think that just kind of brings things into a bit of perspective of, yes, there is youthful disillusionment that occurs, but also there's a certain preserved youthful energy about Catherine that continues throughout the novel. And then obviously we're talking a great deal about reading and novels, and this is definitely the most literary of Austen's books. She is referencing a lot of books that I have never read, I probably will never read, though it kind of makes me want to read an Anne Radcliffe book. Is anyone, are they good? But reading takes on a double meaning in Northanger Abbey, and it's this idea that you are reading books, yes, but also you are reading the people around you and their intentions, and are they a good person to put your trust in? Catherine is not good at this, as previously stated, and she's not really consuming meritable reading material either. She needs to improve the quality of her reading, but also she needs to improve reading other people and their intentions. While she can discern, for example, that the general is not a kind man, the only conclusion she really can draw is straight out of a Gothic novel. It's what she's been reading, it's what she's been consuming, so she doesn't like this guy. Clearly he murdered his wife. So she just has to grow up and she has to expand what she reads to understand what the real world in Britain exists like. And she decides that such villains could only exist in the Pyrenees or the Alps settings for Gothic novels. By the end of the novel, is Catherine an expert on reading people or books? No, but she is much improved. And we can hope that she continues to improve after the novel, I guess. Another big theme throughout all of the book is wealth and ostentation. So the Morlands have enough. They are happy with what they have. And it comes out at the end that Catherine has a dowry of about £3,000, which is not a lot, but it's something. It's good. We should say yay for Catherine. The Allens are very rich, but a bit showy, but they are generous towards Catherine. And the Tilneys are very rich, but the general is just mostly concerned about making and spending money and making improvements. And he really likes when his stuff is better than Mr. Allen's. So he does this tour through the park with Eleanor and Catherine, and he asks like, hey, how does this compare to Mr. Allen? How does this compare to Mr. Allen? And he finds that his is better, and he's like, that's right, it's better. Eleanor is able to make a match with the man that she loves, but really only after it becomes financially acceptable to her father. The Thorpes are poor and seeking beneficial matches, and they greatly want to raise their economic place in the world. In and of itself, I don't think that's a bad thing, but the way that they go about it through flirtation and betrayal and manipulation, it just becomes not good. And their pursuit of wealth corrupts them into people who are not pleasant to be around. Isabella forsakes the poor, though not poor, James in favor of Captain Frederick, who is the heir of Northanger Abbey. That match would just never be approved by his father, so Frederick also would never voluntarily make that match. Isabella was very foolish. In her pursuit of wealth, she lost sight of what she had. It's kind of like the one in the hand is worth more than two in the bush. So there might be two in there, but also you could have just married James Morland and probably had a pretty happy life, if that is how you decided to live. Northanger Abbey is a symbol. Austen really draws her portrait of Bath society from her own experience from having visited Bath several times in her youth and living there as an adult. But Northanger Abbey is probably kind of more of a product of the Gothic novels themselves that Austen has read, and as far as we know, she didn't visit and stay in any great houses. So a crumbling old building is often found in Gothic works, some of which feature an abbey, which used to house nuns and monks. And then they were sold or abandoned and later purchased by some lord or baron who is a general villain in these novels. And from a historic standpoint, the crown took possession of all church land during the Reformation. So they got rid of all the Catholics, they kicked out all the nuns and the monks, and the priors sold all of the church land to the highest bidder. So that's how a lot of lords got their castles or their abbeys or their priories. They just bought them during this kind of Reformation period, and then they either refurbished them or maintained them from there. So the nuns and the monks have been exiled from these walls for probably about 2 centuries at this point. So for Catherine, Northanger Abbey symbolizes this kind of imagined ideal of Gothic and romantic horror. And as soon as she enters the Abbey, she starts to think of herself as a Gothic heroine. But unlike Bath, which is kind of just this pleasant tourist town, the Abbey has the potential to be a place of mystery and perhaps adventure. And at least in Catherine's mind, that's what she's hoping it'll be. But the Abbey turns out just to kind of be a nice old building. It's not frightening, really. So Catherine thankfully never seeks to achieve Northanger Abbey. So she doesn't think of marrying Frederick to get to live there, and she doesn't want Henry to inherit it. And what I find kind of most admirable about Catherine is that she is confronted with a comfortable and smaller home in a village, Woodston, and she's staying at the Abbey. So she really is going like a direct comparison, and she is so much happier with the idea of Woodston. And it isn't anything to the Abbey, but Catherine likes Woodston. It's a large and populous town, and the parsonage is not set far away from it. So I think Catherine can really envision herself living there and then being able to go and be in the village, but then also to have access to nature, to go on these long walks. So it's this perfect marriage of what she liked of Bath, what she likes of Northanger Abbey, which is the Tilneys, and then what she likes about home in Fullerton, which is the ability to be close to nature. Woodston, Catherine really could have a comfortable home and access to the natural world, good society, Henry Tilney, who she loves. So in short, Woodston represents the marriage of what is best in Austen's view. Good society, people of good sense, in a home situated ideally close to nature. It's a comfortable home with a man who is worthy of respect by his wife. And our heroine, Catherine Morland, has the happiest of endings. And that is the theme, plot, history, author's life of Northanger Abbey. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I feel like my voice really went at the end. I have no idea what I'm gonna make next. Maybe something about Egypt. Maybe I'm gonna rank Hercule Poirot novels. I don't know. Thanks for watching. I'm amazed if you got this far. Subscribe and like this video. Bye.